"You're like a workhorse, easy to ride," her husband mocked during the divorce trial. But the moment his wife took off her dress, the courtroom gasped. My husband said that loud enough for the whole room to hear. His lawyer didn't even flinch. I just stood there in this ugly gray blazer I'd worn to every single one of his company dinners for 8 years. Every holiday party where he'd introduce me as my wife and immediately turn to talk to someone else. Every client dinner where I smiled on cue and made him look like a man who had everything together at home. The workhorse line got a quiet laugh from his side of the room. One of his colleagues was there as a character witness. The guy had been at our house for Thanksgiving twice, ate the food I made, sat at the table I cooked for. I watched him smirk and look down at his notepad like he was trying to hide it. I didn't react. I had been waiting 4 months for this exact moment and I wasn't going to spend it on my face. Here's how it actually started. 3 months before he filed, I was doing our taxes on the shared laptop. We'd always done them together, but that year he kept putting it off, kept saying he'd get to it, and eventually I just sat down and opened TurboTax myself. That's when I found the second folder. It wasn't hidden exactly, just nested inside a folder called Insurance Docs 2019, like he figured I'd never go looking there. Spreadsheets, transaction records, $340,000 moved into an account I had never seen before, spread over 4 years in amounts small enough not to trigger anything. $1,200 here, $4,000 there. Once, a single transfer of $18,000 on the same week, we had a fight about whether we could afford to replace the water heater. I sat there for probably 20 minutes just staring at the screen. My coffee went cold. I didn't close the laptop. I took photos of every single page with my phone. Then I closed it, went to bed, and didn't say a word. The next morning, I called my cousin Dana. Dana's a forensic accountant. She does fraud investigation for a living, and she is not a person who panics. I sent her everything, and she called me back 2 hours later and said, "Okay, this is actually really clean work for someone who thought they were hiding it." She meant that as a bad thing for him. We spent the next 6 weeks building the paper trail. Dana pulled records I didn't even know existed, cross-referenced transfers with dates, found the name attached to the account by week 3. Her name was Brooke. She worked at the commercial real estate firm his company used. They'd been seeing each other since year 2 of our marriage. I found her Instagram that night, a photo from a resort in Tulum from a trip he'd told me was a work conference. I didn't confront him. I didn't change my behavior at all. I kept making dinner, kept asking about his day, kept wearing the same gray blazer to whatever event required me to stand next to him and look like his life was in order. Every time I almost said something, I thought about Dana's spreadsheet and I shut my mouth. When he finally served me the papers, I called my attorney the same afternoon. Her name is Carol, and she has been doing family law for 22 years, and she said, "Bring me everything Dana put together." She went quiet reading through it and then said, "He has no idea you have this, does he?" I said no. She said, "Good. Keep it that way." We walked into that courtroom prepared. I wore the gray blazer on purpose, over a dress I'd bought specifically for this day. Deep burgundy, fitted, the kind of thing he always said I didn't have the figure for. I wanted to look exactly like what he expected when he opened his mouth. I wanted him comfortable. I wanted that smirk. His lawyer went first and built the whole case around the idea that I had contributed nothing, that I was a dependent, that I had spent 8 years being carried by a man who'd built everything. The workhorse line was the closer, a little courtroom theater. His lawyer sat down looking satisfied. Then Carol stood up. She requested permission to submit a financial exhibit. The judge nodded. Carol placed the binder on the evidence table and handed copies to opposing counsel. I watched his lawyer open it, watched him go still on the first page. He turned to my husband and said something I couldn't hear. My husband looked down at the binder. That's when I stood up, unzipped the blazer, and laid it across my chair. The judge looked up from his copy of the exhibit. $340,000 in documented transfers over 4 years. Every transaction cross-referenced with dates and source accounts. His signature or digital authorization on every single one. And the name on the receiving account with 3 years of corroborating communication Dana had helped locate through the financial records. His lawyer asked for a recess. My husband's face had gone the color of copy paper. The judge denied the recess. The marriage didn't start badly. That's the part that's hardest to explain to people. When you say, "My husband turned out to be a liar who was stealing from our joint accounts and sleeping with someone for 6 of the 8 years we were married," people want a clean origin story. They want you to say you saw red flags and ignored them. They want the narrative where the warning signs were there from day one and you just couldn't see them. That's not what happened. What happened is that I met Daniel at a work conference in Chicago when I was 29. I was there for a marketing agency I'd been at for 4 years. He was there for a commercial real estate firm, not the one Brooke would eventually work at, a different one, his first job out of grad school. We met at the hotel bar on a Thursday night because both of our dinner plans had fallen through. He was funny. He asked real questions. He remembered the things I said. When I told him I'd grown up in Akron, he said, "What part?" and actually knew the answer when I told him. That doesn't sound like much, but I'd been living in Philadelphia for 6 years at that point, and most people I met still thought Ohio was basically a cornfield. We did long distance for 14 months, Philadelphia to Chicago, back and forth every 3 weeks or so. I paid for probably a third of the flights. He paid for the rest. We split hotels when we traveled somewhere new together. None of that felt like a big deal at the time. It felt like 2 adults figuring it out. He moved to Philadelphia when I was 31, got a job at a smaller firm, took a pay cut to do it, and I remember thinking that meant something. I remember thinking you don't take a pay cut and move cities for someone you're not serious about. We got engaged 8 months after he moved, married 11 months after that at a venue outside of Philadelphia that cost more than either of us was comfortable with, but that his mother pushed for, and that we both eventually agreed to because it was easier than the alternative. I should say here that I liked his mother at the the time. Her name is Patricia, and she is a specific kind of woman. She has very strong opinions about everything from table settings to the correct way to load a dishwasher, and she voices all of them constantly. But in the first few years, she was warm to me. She asked about my work. She remembered my birthday without being prompted. She called me on a Tuesday once just to tell me she'd seen a news story about the marketing campaign I'd worked on and that she was proud of me. That changed. I'll get to that. The first year of marriage was fine. Not electric, not a fairy tale, but fine. Which I think is actually what most people mean when they say their first year was great. We cooked dinner together most nights. We had friends over on weekends. We went to Portugal for 2 weeks that summer, and it was genuinely one of the best trips of my life. I have a photo from a cafe in Lisbon where we're both sunburned and laughing at something I can't remember now, and we both look like people who are happy. I kept that photo on my desk at work for years. I'm looking at it right now, and I still can't fully square it with everything that came after. The shift was gradual. That's what I want people to understand. It wasn't a door slamming. It was more like the temperature dropping 1 degree at a time until one day you notice you're freezing and you can't remember when it got cold. Year 2, Daniel started traveling more for work. The commercial real estate industry had picked up, and his firm was expanding into new markets. He was gone 2, sometimes 3 weeks out of the month. I was busy too. I'd been promoted to director at the agency, and I was managing a team for the first time. We were 2 adults with demanding careers and not enough time. And I told myself that was normal, that it was a season, that it would balance out. It didn't balance out, but I kept telling myself it would. Year 3, I noticed he'd stopped asking about my work, not in a dramatic way. There was no moment where he said, "I don't care about your job." He just stopped initiating. I'd share something about a campaign or a client problem, and he'd nod and look at his phone and say, yeah, and move on. I told myself he was tired, that travel was exhausting, that I probably did the same thing sometimes without noticing. I started keeping a mental tally, not intentionally, just the way you notice things when they happen enough times. The tally was not good. By year 4, I had quietly stopped sharing things with him, not because I'd decided to, more because I'd learned, without realizing I was learning it, that sharing things with Daniel produced nothing. No response, no follow-up, sometimes not even eye contact. So I stopped. I talked to my friend Nora instead, or my sister, or occasionally Dana, even though we weren't especially close then. I had people in my life. I wasn't isolated, but I was lonely inside my marriage in a way I didn't have vocabulary for yet. Year 5, I asked if we could go to couples therapy. He said sure. We went twice, and then he got busy with a deal and we never rescheduled. I brought it up again in year 6, and he said we didn't need it, that things were fine, that I was overthinking. I remember standing in our kitchen when he said that. I remember thinking, who decides what fine means? Year 7, I stopped asking. Here's what I want to be clear about. I did not know about Brooke. I did not suspect a specific person. What I suspected was the general shape of what was happening, that Daniel had emotionally checked out of our marriage and was investing that energy somewhere else, but I had no name for it. I thought it was work. I thought it was stress. I thought it was the cumulative weight of 2 people who had grown in different directions without meaning to. I was wrong about the shape, but right about the core of it. He had checked out. He had been putting his energy somewhere else. I just didn't know how literally true that was until I found the folder. I want to walk through the folder carefully because I think the details matter. The laptop was a shared machine we'd bought together in year 3. A MacBook Pro we used primarily for joint finances, taxes, shared documents, the occasional Netflix binge when someone monopolized the TV. Neither of us used it as our main work computer. It lived on the kitchen counter. It was a Sunday in October. I had been putting off the taxes for 2 months because every time I sat down to do them, Daniel had a reason why he'd handle it later, and I'd learned not to push back on things like that. But it was October, and I needed an extension if we weren't going to file, so I opened the laptop and went looking for our 2021 tax documents. I found the folder called Insurance Docs 2019 while looking for the 2021 W-2 folder. I clicked on it expecting to find, I don't know, dental plan PDFs. What I found instead was a subfolder labeled with a string of numbers, not a date format I recognized, just a sequence. And inside that subfolder were 11 spreadsheet files named with 2-letter codes I didn't immediately recognize. I opened the first one. It took me a few seconds to understand what I was looking at. The spreadsheet had 4 columns: date, amount, account number fragment, and a column labeled simply B. The entries went back 3.5 years. The amounts ranged from $800 to $18,000. The total at the bottom of the amount column, and I remember exactly what it said because I stared at it for a very long time, was $247,340. I opened the second file. Different dates, some overlap, a continuation, another $92,000 over roughly 18 months. I sat there and did the math on my phone. $339,340. I rounded up when I told people later. It was effectively $340,000. I opened 4 more files. They were all the same structure. Different account fragments, some matching, some new. The column label B had check marks in it on some rows and dashes on others. I would find out later, much later, when Dana had gone through everything, that the check marks corresponded to transfers that had cleared without issue, and the dashes were ones that had required a secondary authorization that he'd apparently set up through a separate login. I took photos of every spreadsheet, 41 photos total. I know that because I counted them that night when I was lying in bed next to him while he slept. I did not sleep. Dana answered on the second ring. It was a Monday morning, and I had called her from my car in the parking garage at work because I couldn't have this conversation in the office, and I couldn't have had it at home. I told her what I'd found. She asked me to send the photos. I sent them while we were still on the phone. I could hear her opening files on her end. She was quiet for almost 4 minutes. I know because I was watching watching the timer on my phone. Then she said, "Okay, this is actually really organized for someone who thought they were hiding it." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "It means he kept records," which is either very stupid or very arrogant. Either way, it means he made my job easier. A pause. "How are you doing right now?" I told her I was fine. She said okay in a tone that meant she knew that wasn't true, but she was going to let me have it. I asked her what she needed from me. She said she needed everything she could get access to. Bank statements, investment account summaries, tax returns going back 5 years, anything I could pull without him noticing. She told me to do it carefully, to pull one thing at a time over the course of a week or two, rather than downloading everything in one session that might show up in a browser history. She also told me to get my own email address, not through any account connected to our household, something new, and to use that for everything going forward. I did everything she said. Over the next 3 weeks, I pulled statements from 4 accounts: our joint checking, our joint savings, a joint investment account we'd opened in year 3, and a home equity line of credit I'd almost forgotten existed. I didn't have access to whatever account he was transferring money into, but Dana said she didn't need it. She could build the case entirely from the source accounts, showing money leaving, and let the transfers speak for themselves. She called me on a Thursday evening 3 weeks in. "I have the name," she said. I was in the kitchen cutting vegetables. I put the knife down. "The receiving account is under a business called BCR Consulting LLC," she said, "registered in Delaware in 2018. Delaware LLCs are easy to make anonymous, but the registration agent made an error, a very small one, a clerical thing, that attached a personal contact email to the filing. The email address is first initial, last name, at a domain that belongs to a commercial real estate brokerage." She read me the name, Brooke Rennick. I wrote it down on the notepad I kept next to the stove for grocery lists, on a blank page in the middle, so it wouldn't be the first thing someone saw if they flipped to the front. "She's been at the firm since 2019, Dana said. "Hired about 8 months after the first transfer." I did the math. The first transfer was in October 2018. He had been at a conference in October 2018. I had not been at that conference. I said, "How long do you need to finish everything?" She said, 3 more weeks, maybe 4. "I want to be thorough." I said, "Okay." I went back to cutting the vegetables. Daniel came home 40 minutes later and asked what was for dinner, and I told him pasta, and he said great and went to change clothes. I stood at the stove and watched the water come to a boil, and I thought about the word thorough and what it meant to have someone in your corner who cared about being thorough. I found Brooke's Instagram that night after Daniel fell asleep. I want to be careful about what I say here because I'm aware of how this part sounds, the bitter wife scrolling through the other woman's photos at midnight. But I want to be honest about it because I think it was actually important for me, psychologically, not the way people might expect. Her account was mostly public. She posted the way a lot of people in their early 30s post: travel photos, food, occasional gym content, pictures with friends. She was attractive in a way that was entirely unmemorable, if that makes sense. Not because she was plain, but because there was nothing distinctive about her. Blonde, fit, good at posing. I found the Tulum photo about 3 weeks back in her feed, January of the previous year. The caption said, "Needed this," and the location tag said a resort I recognized by name because Daniel had mentioned it to me once as somewhere we should go someday. The photo was just her, solo, on a beach chair, but she had tagged the location, and when I clicked through to the location tag, I found, among dozens of other photos from that week, a photo posted by someone I didn't recognize. A man standing at a swim-up bar, in which the background, slightly out of focus, included a woman in a yellow swimsuit, and next to her, a man in swim trunks whose face I knew. He had told me that trip was a conference in Miami. I put my phone face down on the nightstand. I had been prepared for the financial part. Dana had prepared me for it. What I was not fully prepared for was the specific, physical reality of the confirmation. Not the abstract knowledge that something had been happening, but the concrete image of it, slightly out of focus in someone else's vacation photo. I lay there for a long time. Then I thought about Dana's spreadsheets, about the $340,000, about the brokerage account in Delaware, about the fact that he had not only been cheating on me, but had been building a financial infrastructure around it for years, routing money out of our joint accounts systematically, treating our shared life as a resource to draw from. I thought about every dinner I'd made, every event I'd shown up to in that gray blazer, every time I'd smiled and said the right thing and made him look like a man whose life was in order. I thought about the water heater we decided we couldn't afford. The wave of emotion I was bracing for didn't come. What came instead was something quieter and colder, and honestly, much more useful. I went to sleep. Dana finished her work 5 weeks after that first call. She sent me a 47-page document she called a financial narrative, a term she said she used because it was the clearest way to describe it to non-accountants. It told a story. It had a beginning, a middle, and a very clear accounting of what had gone where over 4 years. Dates, amounts, account numbers, the LLC registration, the email error that connected the LLC to a name, and a section at the end that cross-referenced the transfer dates with Daniel's travel calendar, which I had provided, showing that 34 of the 41 transfers had occurred within 48 hours of a trip he'd taken for work. She also included, as an appendix, screenshots of the LLC's registered address, a condo in the Rittenhouse Square neighborhood of Philadelphia, not Chicago, not wherever Brooke was supposedly based, Philadelphia, the same city where we lived, where I went to work every day, where I had been cutting vegetables at the stove. I called Carol the same afternoon I read the document. Carol's full name is Carol Edmonds, and she has a corner office in a building on Walnut Street with one of those waiting rooms that is designed to make you feel like everything is under control. Dark wood furniture. A small fountain in the corner that I initially found annoying and later found genuinely soothing. A paralegal named Gwen who brings you coffee without asking and remembers how you take it after your first visit. I'd gotten Carol's name from Nora, my closest friend since college, who had used her 3 years before for what Nora called a fairly uncomplicated situation, and what I understood to be her ex-husband attempting to hide assets through a family business in New Jersey. Nora came out of that situation with more than she went in with. I had filed Carol's name in the back of my mind without really thinking I would ever need it. I needed it. I sat across from Carol on a Tuesday afternoon in February, with Dana's 47-page document and my 41 phone photos and a yellow legal pad I'd used to write down every question I could think of. Carol read through the document while I sat there. She is not a small talk person during working moments. She read. I waited. The fountain did its thing in the corner. After about 20 minutes, she set the document down and looked at me over her reading glasses. He has no idea you have this, she said. It wasn't a question. No, I said. Has he filed yet? Not yet. But his behavior has changed in the last 2 weeks. I think it's coming. She nodded slowly. When he files, you don't react. You don't call him. You don't send a text. You come directly to me. Can you do that? I said yes. She said, good. Because right now you have something very valuable, which is that he thinks you're the workhorse. She paused. He thinks you've been too busy keeping his life running to notice what he was doing. We are going to let him keep thinking that for as long as we possibly can. He served me the papers 11 days later. I called Carol from the car. I did not call Daniel. I did not text him. I drove to the parking garage, sat in my car, read every page of the filing, called Carol, and then went upstairs and ran a status meeting for my team about a campaign we were launching in 3 weeks. The filing was, as Carol had predicted, aggressive. His lawyer, a man named Thad, which Carol later said told her everything she needed to know, had structured it around the claim that I had no significant claim to joint assets because my income over the course of the marriage had been secondary to Daniel's and my non-financial contributions were, in their framing, negligible. The word they used was marginal. I had been, according to Thad's filing, a marginal contributor to a marriage I had spent 8 years actively maintaining. Carol sent me an email that night with 2 words: good, perfect. I did not understand what she meant until she explained it in our next meeting. He's overplayed his hand, she said. He came in aggressive because he thinks you don't have anything. If he knew about Dana's document, he would have filed something much more careful. This filing tells me exactly what his strategy is and what he thinks your strategy is. She tapped the yellow copy of the filing. He thinks you're going to come in emotional and underprepared. He's built his whole case around you being the lesser party. She smiled, which Carol does rarely and efficiently. So that's what we're going to look like, right up until we don't. The preparation for the hearing took 2 months. Carol was meticulous in a way that I found, honestly, therapeutic after years of being married to someone who treated thoroughness as optional. She went through Dana's document line by line with her own financial expert, a man named Robert, who wore bow ties and spoke about spreadsheets with the enthusiasm of someone describing a great meal. They identified 11 key transactions to highlight, organized chronologically and by dollar amount, each one tied to a specific date, a specific account, a specific authorization trail. They also built a secondary exhibit Carol called the calendar correlation, the section Dana had done cross-referencing transfers with travel dates, expanded and formatted for a courtroom presentation. 34 transfers in 48 hours of a business trip. Presented visually, it looked like what it was: a pattern, not a mistake, not a coincidence, a system. I had 2 roles in this preparation. The first was to gather any additional documentation Carol requested, which I did. The second was to stay calm and not tip my hand, which was harder. There were 3 weeks during the preparation period where Daniel and I were still living in the same house. We had agreed, through lawyers via email, that I would take the guest room and he would stay in the master, and that we would manage shared spaces with what his lawyer called civil coexistence. This is a real legal term, apparently. Civil coexistence looked like this. We made our own food. We were polite if we encountered each other in the hallway. We watched television in separate rooms. He used the kitchen between 6 and 8 in the evening. I used it after 9. We had not had a real conversation in 11 days by the time he moved out, which he did on a Saturday in March, taking the TV from the master bedroom and the KitchenAid mixer that had technically been a wedding gift to both of us. He left a note on the counter. It said, "You can have the rest." 4 words. I photographed the note. Carol said it wasn't relevant, but that I should keep it anyway. I kept it. The night before the hearing, I did not try to sleep early. I've learned about myself over the years that forcing sleep before something important doesn't work. I stayed up until 11:30, read for an hour, set 2 alarms, and went to bed. I slept 6 hours. In the morning, I made coffee, ate toast, and got dressed. The dress was burgundy. I'd bought it specifically 6 weeks before, during one of my lunch breaks, from a boutique in Rittenhouse that I'd walked past 100 times and never gone into. It fit well. It was not flashy, but it was exactly the kind of thing Daniel had spent years telling me I didn't pull off, a phrase he used for things that were form-fitting or colorful or in any way declarative. I had believed him for a long time. I had stopped believing him somewhere around year 5, but I'd kept dressing the way he preferred anyway because it was easier. I put the gray blazer over it. The blazer was deliberate. It was the same one I'd worn to approximately 40 company events over 8 years. His colleagues knew that blazer. His mother knew that blazer. If anyone in that courtroom looked at me, I wanted them to see exactly what they expected to see. I drove to Carol's office first. We went over everything one more time. She handed me a copy of the binder, our copy, separate from the exhibit copy, and told me to put it in my bag and not open it unless she asked me to. Then we walked to the courthouse together. Thad was already there when we arrived. He was talking to Daniel in the hallway in the way lawyers talk to clients before hearings. Close, low voiced, the body language of someone delivering a confident pre-game speech. Daniel was in a gray suit. He looked, I noticed, tired in a way that expensive grooming couldn't fully cover. There were shadows under his eyes. He looked at me when I walked in. He looked at the gray blazer. I watched him relax slightly, the subtle loosening of someone who has seen what they expected to see. That was the last time I saw him relaxed for a long time. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. I think courtrooms on television give you the impression of something cathedral. High ceilings, long rows of seats, the kind of space that makes the stakes feel grand. This was a family courtroom in Philadelphia. Drop ceilings, fluorescent lighting, a bench that looked like it belonged in a school cafeteria, chairs along the wall for observers, maybe 20 of them, about half occupied. Daniel's colleague, the one who would smirk at the workhorse line, was there in the third row. His name is Greg Tanner, and he has been Daniel's friend since they were both at the same firm years ago. He was at our wedding. I made him a birthday cake in year 2 because Daniel mentioned offhand that Greg's wife had just left him and he could use some cheering up. I made a red velvet cake from scratch and brought it to their office. Greg was sitting in the third row with a legal pad open on his knee. I sat down at our table. Carol set her bag down, arranged her folders, and did not look up at Thad or at Daniel. She had the focused, unhurried energy of someone who had done this hundreds of times and was not impressed by the room. The judge came in. His name was Judge Harkins, a man in his late 50s with the expression of someone who has heard every possible version of every possible story and is now primarily interested in the documentation. Carol had told me about him. She said he was fair, that he valued preparation, and that he disliked theatrics. We were going to give him no theatrics until the very last moment. Thad went first. He was good. I'll give him that. He had a smooth, confident rhythm, the kind of courtroom presence that comes from genuinely believing you're the most prepared person in the room. He laid out their case methodically. Daniel's income history versus mine, the growth of the assets during the marriage, attributed entirely to Daniel's earning, my limited independent contribution to the household finances, and the argument that the asset division I was requesting was disproportionate and unsupported. He saved the workhorse line for the close. I think he had rehearsed it. The timing was too clean, the pause before it too deliberate. He looked at the judge, then he looked at me, and he said, "My client has noted that his wife functioned in this marriage more like a workhorse than a partner. Dependable, but not someone who meaningfully drove the value that is now at issue." He sat down. The room was quiet, except for a very quiet sound from Greg Tanner's direction that might have been a laugh and might have been a cough, but that landed, regardless, like an endorsement. I stood up and took off the blazer. I want to describe this carefully because I've told the story a few times, and I noticed people want it to be more dramatic than it was. I didn't throw the blazer. I didn't make a speech. I didn't look at Daniel. I simply stood, unzipped the blazer, took it off, and laid it across the back of my chair. The burgundy dress was underneath. What I was doing, and what Carol and I had discussed explicitly, was resetting the room's red on me. Up until that moment, I had been the gray blazer, the known quantity, the wife who had shown up looking exactly like what Daniel's lawyer had described. The moment the blazer came off, something shifted. You could feel it. Not dramatic, just a recalibration. The judge looked up from his notes. Carol stood. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit a financial exhibit to the record." She placed the binder on the evidence table. Gwen, who had come as a paralegal assistant, handed copies across to Thad. I was watching Thad when he opened it. He opened to the first page, the summary page which Carol had formatted as a one-page overview with the total figure in a slightly larger font at the top, and he went still, not dramatically. He didn't gasp or push back from the table. He just went very still, the way someone goes still when they are doing a rapid recalculation. He turned to Daniel, said something low. Daniel leaned over and looked at the binder. Then Daniel looked at me. It was the first time he had looked directly at me since I'd sat down. His expression was, I thought about how to describe this, and the most accurate word I can find is recalibrating, like a machine that has received unexpected input and is running a new process. I looked back at him. I didn't smile. I didn't react. I just held his gaze for about 3 seconds and then looked back at Judge Harkins. Carol walked the judge through the exhibit. The structure was clean and Carol presented it that way. No editorializing, no drama, just the facts in sequence. Joint checking account, transfers out, dates, amounts, account fragments, the Delaware LLC, the registration error that attached the LLC to a name, the fact that 34 of 41 transfers occurred within 48 hours of documented business travel. The calendar pages cross-referenced with the transaction log. Judge Harkins read. He asked 2 clarifying questions, both technical, both about the account tracing methodology. Carol answered them precisely. Thad objected twice, both times on procedural grounds. Both objections were overruled. At the point where Carol referenced the LLC and the name attached to it, Brooke Rennick, BCR Consulting, Daniel's jaw tightened. It was the first visible physical reaction I'd seen from him during the whole presentation. Not surprise, exactly. More like the specific tension of a person who has been caught and is now assessing how badly. Carol set the exhibit down and looked at the judge. The total transferred from joint accounts to BCR Consulting LLC over 48 months is $339,340, she said. My client is requesting full restitution of the misappropriated funds in addition to the standard equitable division of remaining marital assets. Thad asked for a recess. Judge Harkins looked at him over his reading glasses. We've been in session for 42 minutes, counselor. He denied the recess. What happened over the next 90 minutes was, in Carol's later description, about as clean as these things get. Thad tried several approaches, disputing the tracing methodology, arguing that some transfers might represent legitimate business expenses, suggesting that the LLC could have served a purpose unrelated to what the documentation implied. Judge Harkins let him make make each argument and then asked each time for the supporting documentation. Thad did not have supporting documentation. What he had were assertions. Carol had a binder. At one point, Thad asked for a continuance to gather additional financial records. Judge Harkins said, "Counselor, you filed this petition 4 months ago. If there are additional financial records that support your client's position, I would expect you to have gathered them in the course of normal discovery." He denied the continuance. There was a moment, maybe an hour into it, where I looked over at Daniel and he was sitting very still with his hands flat on the table in front of him. Not clenched, just flat. The posture of someone who has run out of moves and is waiting for it to be over. I thought about the note he'd left on the kitchen counter. "You can have the rest." 4 words. At the time, I'd been too numb to feel much about it. Now, watching him sit there with his hands flat on the table, I understood what he'd meant by it. He'd thought the rest was nothing. He'd thought he'd already taken what mattered. He was wrong about that. Judge Harkins issued his ruling at 11:40 in the morning. Full restitution of the $339,340. Equitable division of remaining marital assets based on standard contribution analysis, which in practice meant I received a significantly larger share than I would have under Daniel's original framing, because my negligible contributions turned out to include 8 years of managing a household, supporting a career that benefited from that stability, and doing the taxes on a laptop that had a very revealing folder in it. The marriage between myself and Daniel Marsh was officially dissolved at 11:42 a.m. on a Thursday in April. I sat there for a moment after Judge Harkins left the bench. Carol was already packing her folders with the efficient, unsentimental movements of someone who has just completed a task that was always going to end this way. I looked at the blazer folded over the back of my chair. I left it there. Here's what nobody tells you about winning. I had prepared extensively for the hearing. I had prepared, in a general sense, for what it would feel like to sit in that room and watch the case play out. What I had not prepared for was the afternoon that followed, or the week after that, or the specific texture of going home to an apartment that was entirely mine and sitting down on a couch and not knowing what to do with my hands. I moved out of the house in March, 2 weeks after Daniel did. I'd found a 2-bedroom apartment in Graduate Hill, not because I needed 2 bedrooms, but because the second bedroom was going to be an office, and having a room designated specifically for work felt like something I needed to claim. I had it painted a dark green. I put a desk in it and a good lamp and the framed print from my Lisbon trip. Not the photo of me and Daniel, a different one. A street scene I'd taken on my own one morning before he woke up. My friend Nora helped me move in on a Saturday in early March. She brought wine and a box of cleaning supplies, and she did not say anything about Daniel unless I brought him up. That is one of the specific gifts of a friendship that has lasted since college. The person knows when to let you set the pace. I brought it up once that afternoon while we were assembling a bookshelf. I said something like, "I keep waiting to feel something, and instead, I just feel tired." Nora said, "That's what it feels like when something's been over for a long time and the paperwork finally catches up." I thought about that for weeks. The hearing was in April. The 6 weeks between moving in and the hearing were, honestly, fine. Not good. Not bad. I went to work. I met with Carol twice. I called Dana and thanked her, and she said she was glad she could help and that if I ever needed a forensic accountant again, she hoped it was for better reasons. I cooked dinner most nights. Real dinners, things that took time, things I wanted to eat, and ate them at my own table in my own apartment without calculating whether Daniel would be home and whether he'd have opinions about what I'd made. That was not nothing. The absence of that calculation. I hadn't realized how much mental space it had been taking up until it was gone. After the hearing, I called my mother and my sister and Dana and Nora in that order. My mother cried, which she does when she is relieved rather than sad. My sister said, "I always thought he was a specific kind of mediocre," and made me laugh for the first time all day. Dana asked about the ruling, confirmed she'd invoice me for her work, and said, "I'm proud of you," in the no-nonsense tone of someone who means it precisely. Nora took me to dinner that evening. We went to a wine bar we'd been going to since we were in our late 20s, and we split 2 bottles of something good, and she let me talk as much or as little as I wanted, and what I talked about mostly was not Daniel and not the case, but the dark green office and the desk lamp and the fact that I was thinking about taking on some freelance work that I'd been putting off for 3 years because Daniel had thought it was a distraction. It was a good dinner. The aftermath took longer than the event. That's something people don't tell you. The hearing was one morning. The unwinding of 8 years was a different project entirely, one that didn't have a clear endpoint and didn't generate clean paperwork and couldn't be broken down into a 47-page financial narrative. Patricia, his mother, called me once. It was about 3 weeks after the hearing. She said she wanted me to know she hadn't known about Brooke, that if she had, she would have told me, that she was ashamed of what Daniel had done. She said it with a careful, slightly formal diction of someone who has rehearsed the call. I believed her mostly. What I believed less was her next sentence, which was that she hoped we could remain in contact. I said I would think about it. I have not called her back. I don't think I'm going to. Not because I hold her responsible, I don't, but because maintaining that connection would require a kind of emotional labor that I'm currently using for other things. I think about the water heater sometimes. Specifically, I think about the night Daniel and I had that conversation, standing in the basement, looking at the unit, having the debate about whether to repair it or replace it and whether we could afford it right now. I think about how I'd done the budget on paper, the way I always did budgets because I was the one who actually tracked our finances month to month, and how I'd said we could stretch to replace it if we held off on the vacation we'd been loosely planning. And Daniel had said, "No, let's just patch it for now. We'll deal with it next year." He'd transferred $4,300 from our joint savings account to BCR Consulting LLC the following Thursday. We patched the water heater. It failed again 6 months later. I replaced it myself after I moved into my apartment. Full replacement, good unit, the kind I should have had in the first place. I paid for it entirely with my own money, which is the only money I have now. And I stood in my own basement and watched it get installed, and I felt genuinely fine about it. That is not a metaphor. I just mean that having a functional water heater that you paid for yourself is a good thing, and I was glad to have it. Dana and I have had dinner twice since all of this. She is, it turns out, very funny when she's not in work mode. Dry, observational, the kind of humor that takes a second to land and then lands cleanly. She told me at our second dinner that she has about 6 cases a year where she finds something in the financials that the client didn't know was there, and that the reactions split pretty evenly between devastation and what she called cold clarity. Which one were you? She asked. I thought about it. Cold clarity, I said. By the time I called you, I think I already knew. I just needed someone to help me be sure. She nodded and poured more wine. Those are actually the easier ones, she said. Not easier for you. Easier for me, because you're already doing the work when you call. You don't need to be talked into it. I am, I think, still doing the work. I don't mean legally. That's done. I mean the quieter work of figuring out who I am when I'm not performing the role of someone whose life is in order, when I'm not wearing the gray blazer, when I'm not making sure the dinner is ready and the event is covered and the right impression is being made. I left the blazer in the courtroom. That was intentional and also slightly impractical because it was a good blazer and I liked it, but it felt like the right thing to do. Carol texted me the next day to say the clerk had set it aside and I could pick it up. I texted back and said to donate it. I don't know where it ended up. I hope whoever has it gets some use out of it. The dark green office is good. The work I was putting off for 3 years has turned out to be something I'm actually good at and that people want. I have a desk lamp I like. I have a water heater that works. I have a friend who is a forensic accountant and who is very funny at dinner. I have a copy of a 47-page financial narrative in the bottom drawer of my desk, which I have not opened since the hearing and which I keep not because I need it, but because it represents, in the most concrete possible form, the answer to every version of the question I had been asking myself for 4 years. The question was, am I wrong about this? Is this in my head? Is the problem me? The answer was 339 pages. The answer was 47 pages. The answer was $339,340. The answer was no. The answer was, you were right. You just needed someone to help you be thorough.